The warm, rich scent of coffee filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversations and the soft clinking of spoons against ceramic cups. Sunlight streamed through the large cafe windows, casting golden hues across the wooden floors. Laura sat at a corner table, fingers loosely wrapped around her latte, lost in her thoughts. It had been a long morning, one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. Deadlines, pressure, and an annoying landlord who wouldn't stop calling. She took a slow, calming breath and closed her eyes, trying to shake off the frustration. That's when she felt it. A presence, too close. Her eyes snapped open, and her entire body stiffened. A man stood beside her, just inches away. His tall frame towered over her as he reached out toward her table. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The dim lighting of the cafe suddenly felt suffocating. She had heard stories, read about them in the news. A woman minding her own business, only to be taken advantage of in broad daylight. She wasn't about to let that happen. The next second happened in a blur. Her pulse roared in her ears as her hand lifted on instinct, her palm cutting through the air with force. Smack! The sharp, echoing slap shattered the peaceful cafe buzz. A stunned silence fell over the space. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Cups clattered onto saucers. Forks froze mid-air. Laura's own breath caught in her throat. The man in front of her stood utterly still, his head slightly turned from the impact of her hand against his cheek. His fingers twitched at his sides, his jaw tightening, and then his eyes met hers. Deep, stormy blue, sharp as glass. A flicker of raw disbelief crossed his face before it vanished, replaced by something darker. Anger. Pure, restrained anger. Laura's stomach dropped. Her gaze darted down to the cup of coffee on his table, untouched. The book in his other hand still open to the same page. He wasn't even looking at her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the heavy silence pressing down on the cafe. A lump lodged itself in her throat. The man Ryan exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching, his fingers curling into fists before relaxing again. The red mark from her slap was already blooming across his cheek, yet he hadn't moved an inch. Laura's chest constricted. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely a breath. I thought. Ryan let out a bitter, humorless chuckle. It was low, controlled, but cold, so cold it sent a shiver down her spine. "Thought what?" he said, his voice razor sharp. His head tilted slightly, his intense gaze pinning her in place. Laura swallowed hard, struggling to form words. She wanted to explain, to justify herself, but every excuse felt weak under the weight of his stare. Ryan's lips curled, but there was no amusement in the gesture. "You thought I was harassing you, didn't you?" His voice was quiet, dangerously calm, but it held a sharp edge. Laura winced, shame creeping up her neck. I misunderstood the situation." "I didn't," his bitter chuckle cut through her words. He shook his head, his smirk disappearing, replaced by something unreadable. "You didn't think," he finished for her. The judgmental whispers started, then murmurs, from the cafe patrons who had witnessed the entire scene. Laura felt the weight of 100 stares pressing into her, burning into her skin. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear. She opened her mouth, desperate to fix what she had just done. "Look," I panicked, and Arian held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Next time, maybe try thinking before you act," he said, voice firm but devoid of any warmth. Laura flinched. Ryan didn't wait for another apology. With a sharp exhale, he turned on his heel and walked away, his movements controlled, precise. Laura remained frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had made a mistake. A terrible, humiliating mistake, and something told her she would never be able to take it back. The morning sun spilled golden light through the glass windows of Sterling Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. The towering skyscraper loomed over Laura as she stepped through the grand entrance, her heart pounding with excitement and nerves. This was it, her big break. An internship at a company of this magnitude could launch her career to unimaginable heights. Clutching her bag tightly, she inhaled deeply, trying to steady the butterflies in her stomach. She had worked so hard for this opportunity. Late nights, endless research, countless applications, everything had led to this moment. Today marked the first step toward her dreams. As she stepped into the elevator, she took one last look at her reflection in the mirrored walls. Professional, confidence, ready, or so she thought. The elevator dinged softly as the doors slid open, revealing a sleek, glass-walled conference room filled with high-ranking executives. The air buzzed with authority, the scent of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. Laura's heart raced as she stepped inside, her hands lightly trembling as she held onto her notepad. She was ready to prove herself. Then she saw him. Seated at the head of the table, exuding authority and quiet power, was Ryan. Her breath hitched, a wave of cold dread washing over her as their eyes met. No, no, no. Her mind screamed in disbelief, but her body was frozen in place, every nerve electrified with shock. She felt like the ground had been yanked from beneath her feet. Ryan leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly tapping against the polished mahogany table. The corner of his lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk, one that sent shivers down her spine. The very man she had humiliated in a crowded cafe, the one whose cheek still probably remembered the sting of her slap, was not just a random stranger. He was her boss. The realization hit her like a freight train. The other interns filed in behind her, but Laura barely registered their presence. The blood in her veins turned to ice as Ryan's sharp, calculating gaze locked onto her, as if peeling away every ounce of her confidence. What was he going to do? Would he fire her on the spot? Make an example out of her? Humiliate her the same way she had humiliated him? Her breath came faster, her palms growing clammy. For a brief, terrifying moment, she considered turning around and walking out of the building. Maybe it wasn't too late to send a last-minute email about a family emergency. Maybe she could just vanish before he had the chance to ruin her. But then, Ryan spoke. "Welcome to Sterling Enterprises," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His tone was smooth, professional, but underneath it there was something else. Amusement? Mockery? Revenge? Laura swallowed hard. His eyes never left her. Was he expecting her to break? To panic? She forced herself to hold his gaze, even as a storm of emotions swirled inside her: shame, regret, panic, fear. This was the same man she had slapped in front of an entire cafe. And now he had all the power. "Let's begin," Ryan continued, his smirk deepening ever so slightly, as if relishing the irony of the situation. Laura sat stiffly in her chair, her heart hammering so violently she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The meeting began, but Laura barely registered the words. Her mind was a mess of worst-case scenarios. Would he sabotage her career? Make her regret ever stepping foot in this company? And worst of all, how was she supposed to work under him? She barely heard the introductions happening around her. The other interns spoke about their achievements, their hopes for the program. Then, it was her turn. She felt Ryan's gaze burning into her before she even looked up. "Laura?" One of the senior executives called her name. She straightened her back, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "Laura Carter," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I recently graduated with a degree in business administration and am excited for the opportunity to contribute here." Ryan's smirk twitched, as if he found something about her words amusing. She gripped her pen tightly, resisting the urge to bolt out of the room. The rest of the meeting went by in a blur, but Laura barely processed any of it. Her thoughts kept spiraling back to the one undeniable fact: she was trapped. And Ryan? He was going to make her life hell. The moment the conference room emptied, Laura lingered, gathering her notepad with trembling fingers. Ryan hadn't spoken to her directly throughout the meeting, but his gaze had lingered just long enough to make her feel like prey. As she reached for her bag, a deep voice stopped her cold. "Laura?" Her spine went rigid. Slowly she turned, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Ryan stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The city skyline stretched behind him, but Laura couldn't focus on anything except him. "Sir?" she said, forcing herself to sound professional, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan tilted his head slightly, as if enjoying the moment. Then he chuckled low, quiet, but filled with undeniable amusement. "Of all the places you could have worked," he mused, his blue eyes glinting with something unreadable, "you had to end up here." Laura clenched her fists at her sides, trying not to shrink under his stare. It wasn't intentional. His smirk deepened. "Is that so?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "Look about the cafe." "Let me guess," Ryan interrupted, his voice deceptively light. "You want to apologize?" Laura's cheeks burned with humiliation. Of course she did. But something about the way he said it made her feel even smaller. Yes, she admitted, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I misjudged the situation. I was wrong, and I shouldn't have reacted that way. Ryan stared at her, silent for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded slightly. Noted. Laura blinked. That's it? Before she could say anything else, he turned towards his desk, dismissing her without another word. The message was clear. He wasn't done with her yet. And from the glint in his eyes, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Laura had always believed that hard work and dedication could overcome any challenge. But she had never imagined that her biggest obstacle at Sterling Enterprises would be her own boss, Ryan. From the moment she had set foot in the company, it had been a battlefield. Ryan wasn't just cold, he was ruthless. He never raised his voice, never scolded her outright, but his actions spoke louder than words. Her workload was double what the other interns were given. Impossible deadlines, tedious reports, last-minute projects, tasks designed to test her limits. It was as if he was pushing her, waiting for her to break. And yet, she refused. Every time he dropped another mountain of work on her desk, she gritted her teeth and got it done. When he ignored her contributions in meetings, she made sure her work spoke for itself. When he threw sharp, cutting remarks at her, she took a deep breath and responded with quiet determination. But that didn't mean she didn't feel it. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to choke the air whenever they were in the same room. Every glance exchanged between them carried unsaid words, unspoken battles. And beneath the simmering hostility, there was something else. Something dangerous. Something neither of them was willing to acknowledge. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied out, Laura sat at her desk, her fingers aching from hours of typing. A massive report Ryan had assigned was due in the morning, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. Just as she was about to shut down her computer, his voice broke the silence. "You're still here." Laura jumped, startled by his sudden presence. She turned to find Ryan leaning against the doorway, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an unreadable expression. His usual arrogance was there, but something about him looked different. His tie was slightly loosened, the top button of his shirt undone, his hair a little messier than usual. He looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man at the end of a long day. Laura straightened her back. "I had work to finish." Ryan's lips curved into a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you did." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning her screen. "This is the second time this week. You've been the last one here." Laura clenched her fists under the desk. "Maybe if I wasn't being assigned double the workload, I'd leave on time like everyone else." Ryan let out a low chuckle, the sound sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Are you saying I'm being unfair?" She hesitated, then met his gaze head-on. "I think we both know you are." His smirk faltered for just a second, so quick that if she had blinked, she would have missed it. His fingers drummed against the desk, his posture relaxed, but there was a storm behind his eyes. Then, instead of another sharp remark, he said something she wasn't expecting. "You're good at what you do." Laura froze. Had she misheard? Ryan Sterling, the man who had been tormenting her since day one, had just complimented her? She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the words or the quiet sincerity in his tone. Her heartbeat stuttered, and she struggled to find a response. I didn't think you noticed." Ryan exhaled, his smirk returning, but this time it was softer, less guarded. "I notice everything." There was something in the way he said it that made the air in the room feel heavier. The tension that had always been laced with hostility suddenly felt different, charged with something else entirely. Something Laura wasn't ready to name. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The office lights flickered slightly, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass windows, bathing the room in a soft glow. Then Ryan's voice dropped just a little, almost as if he was debating saying the words out loud. "Why do you fight so hard?" Laura blinked. "What? You could have quit," he said, stepping closer. "After the first week, after the impossible deadlines, the long nights, after everything I put you through." He studied her carefully. "Why didn't you?" Laura swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Why hadn't she? Maybe it was her stubbornness, maybe it was her pride, maybe it was because, even when he made things hard for her, She never wanted to back down from a challenge. Or maybe it was something more. "I don't run away," she finally said. "And I don't break easily." Ryan tilted his head slightly, his smirk fading into something more serious. "No, you don't." For the first time, there was no sarcasm, no amusement in his voice. Just acknowledgement. Laura felt her heart trip over itself. Then, as quickly as the moment had come, Ryan straightened, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off whatever had just passed between them. "Go home, Carter," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "You'll need rest for what's coming tomorrow." Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Of course. Back to reality. But as Ryan walked away, she couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered on her, just a second too long before he disappeared into the hallway. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one fighting something unspoken. The next few days felt different. Ryan was still tough on her. The tasks were still difficult, the deadlines still brutal. But something had shifted. She caught him watching her in meetings, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Their conversations, though still sharp, held something underneath. And Laura? She felt the tension between them change. It was still there, but now it burned in an entirely different way. Because for the first time, she realized something terrifying. Ryan wasn't just testing her. He was drawn to her. And she? She was starting to feel the same way. Late nights at Sterling Enterprises had become a routine for Laura. The pressure was relentless, the expectations sky high, but she refused to crack under it. No matter how many reports Ryan dumped on her desk or how impossible the deadlines seemed, she met them all with quiet determination. Ryan had expected her to give up. He had wanted her to. He told himself he was testing her, pushing her to her limits, not because of petty revenge, but because he refused to let her slip through the cracks of mediocrity. But Laura? She wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. He watched her in meetings, the way her brows furrowed in concentration, the way she presented ideas with unwavering confidence. There was something about the fire in her eyes, that same fire that had made her bold enough to slap him in a cafe, that made him pause. One evening, just as he was reviewing the financial reports of a failing project, a soft knock sounded on his office door. Laura stepped in, her expression composed but determined. "I have a solution," she said. Ryan leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the Axton deal," she said, stepping closer, placing a neatly compiled report on his desk. "The numbers aren't adding up because the marketing strategy is completely off. I ran an analysis, and if we shift focus to a subscription-based model rather than a one-time purchase, we can turn this around." Ryan stared at her, speechless for the first time in a long time. He had spent weeks trying to salvage this deal, and here she was, an intern, handing him a solution on a silver platter. He slowly picked up the report, scanning through the details, his mind processing her words. It was brilliant, efficient, precise, and it would work. He closed the file, meeting her gaze. "You figured this out on your own?" Laura squared her shoulders. "Yes." Ryan exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk, his mind racing. He should say something, acknowledge what she had done, but the words felt foreign, caught somewhere between his thoughts and his pride. "You've been busy," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. Laura's lips twitched. "You keep me busy." Something about the way she said it, the light sarcasm, the unspoken challenge, made him smirk despite himself. For the first time, he didn't see her as the intern who had embarrassed him in public. He didn't see her as the girl who had been a thorn in his side since the day she walked into his company. He saw her as someone formidable, someone capable, and, much to his own frustration, someone who refused to leave his thoughts. In the days that followed, things between them shifted. The tension was still there, but it was different now, charged with something unspoken. Ryan found himself watching her more closely, listening more carefully. When Laura spoke in meetings, he paid attention. When she debated strategies, he engaged with her arguments. The hostility that once defined their interactions had started to morph into something else, something Ryan wasn't sure he wanted to name. The atmosphere in Sterling Enterprises had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a difference in the way they spoke to each other. The hostility that had once defined Ryan and Laura's interactions was no longer just hostility. Ryan had spent weeks convincing himself that Laura was nothing more than a persistent intern who had the nerve to slap him and then walk into his company as if fate had a cruel sense of humor. But now she was everywhere. She was in every meeting, every late-night strategy session, every project that mattered. And with every moment they spent together, it became harder for him to ignore the way she challenged him, the way she stood her ground, the way she refused to be intimidated. One evening, they were reviewing a marketing proposal together, sitting across from each other in the conference room. The city skyline stretched behind them, lights flickering like a heartbeat against the glass windows. Laura was focused, flipping through the document, her brow furrowed. "This campaign isn't strong enough," she murmured, mostly to herself. Ryan smirked. "Are you saying my team isn't doing a good job?" Laura looked up, eyes glinting. "I'm saying they could do better." There it was again, that challenge in her voice, that undeniable fire. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You always this blunt?" Laura's lips curled slightly. "You'd rather I pretend everything is perfect?" "Not at all," he mused, tilting his head. "I like honesty." Something flickered in her gaze. For a moment, the tension between them stretched, something unspoken simmering just beneath the surface. Then Laura blinked and cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Anyway, I think if we restructure the messaging, Laura," the way Ryan said her name low, quiet, almost careful, made her pause. She met his gaze again, this time with hesitation. Ryan didn't know why he had stopped her. Maybe it was because he had started to notice things he shouldn't, like how her presence calmed the chaos in his mind, or how he found himself looking forward to their arguments, or how, for the first time in years, someone was making him feel something real. He shook the thought away, leaning back in his chair. "Forget it," he muttered. "Let's fix the proposal." Laura didn't push for an explanation, but as they worked, there was an undeniable shift. Their usual battles turned into playful debates. One day, Laura caught him making a mistake in a report and smirked. "So the great Ryan Sterling is human after all." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Carter. Keep pushing me and I might actually fire you this time." Laura rolled her eyes. "No, you won't." Ryan leaned closer. "And why's that?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Because you like having me around." Ryan exhaled sharply, something dangerous flashing in his eyes, but before he could respond, she had already turned back to her work. It was in those moments, small, fleeting moments, that something inside him cracked. And Laura? She felt it too. She told herself she was imagining it. The way he would glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his touch would linger a second too long when he handed her something. The way their banter had shifted from sharp edge to something almost teasing. But deep down, she knew this wasn't her imagination. One night, they were the last two people in the office again. The air was thick with exhaustion, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Laura stretched, letting out a quiet groan. Ryan looked up from his laptop. "Tired?" She gave him a look. "What do you think?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You should go home," Laura sighed. "Not until this is done." Ryan watched her for a moment, then suddenly stood. "Come on." She frowned. "What?" He nodded toward the door. "You need a break. Come with me." Laura hesitated. Ryan Sterling didn't do breaks, and yet something about the way he looked at her made her pulse spike. She stood slowly, following him out of the office and into the rooftop terrace. The cool night air wrapped around them, the distant sound of car horns filling the silence. Laura leaned against the railing, looking out over the city. "Didn't peg you as the type to take breaks," Ryan smirked. "I'm full of surprises." She glanced at him. "I'll believe that when I see it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Ryan broke the silence. "You've changed things." Laura looked at him, brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Since you came here, things have been different." Laura's breath caught in her throat. "Ryan, I don't like different," he admitted, his voice lower now. "I don't like distractions." She swallowed. "Am I a distraction?" Ryan turned to her fully now, eyes dark with something unreadable. "Something dangerous, something intoxicating." "Yes," he said simply. Laura's heart stumbled. For a moment, the world stopped. And then Ryan, the man who had spent weeks pretending she didn't affect him, reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It was the softest touch she had ever felt, and it set her entire world on fire. The dim glow of the office lights cast long shadows across the polished floors as Laura walked toward the break room, her heels clicking softly in the silence. It was late, long past the time she should have left, but work had piled up, and she had stayed back to finish. She had just reached for the door handle when a voice stopped her cold. Ryan, her breath hitched. He was just around the corner, his deep, smooth voice carrying through the hallway. But he wasn't alone. A second voice, firm, authoritative, spoke in response. An investor. Laura hesitated. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something about the conversation made her pause. "She's been a real asset to the team," Ryan was saying. Laura's pulse stuttered. "She works hard, brings fresh ideas," he continued, his tone calculated. "And honestly, she's been instrumental in keeping things on track." A small smile formed on Laura's lips. He was talking about her. For weeks, she had noticed the way his demeanor had shifted around her. The way their arguments had softened into something more like banter. The way his sharp remarks had turned into teasing challenges. It wasn't just work anymore, not with the way he looked at her. At least that's what she had thought. The investor hummed in approval. "So you're saying she's valuable? She's useful," Ryan corrected. The air left Laura's lungs. A strange, sinking feeling settled in her chest. Useful. She had expected him to say something else to acknowledge what had been growing between them. But instead, he spoke about her the same way someone would talk about a tool, a strategy, a number on a spreadsheet. "I'm keeping her close for now," Ryan added. "For now." The words hit her harder than any slap. The investor chuckled. "Smart move. When the quarter ends, you can reassess if she's still worth keeping." Still worth keeping. Laura gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. Her mind reeled. Had she imagined it all? The lingering glances? The way he had reached out to tuck her hair behind her ear on the rooftop? Had it all been a game to him? A sickening realization crept into her bones. She had been fooling herself. She wasn't special. She wasn't different. She was just a pawn in his business empire. A disposable one at that. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced it down, swallowing the sharp sting of betrayal. She had let herself believe that Ryan saw her as more than just an employee, that she had somehow cracked through his cold, calculated exterior. How stupid. Heart pounding, she took a shaky step back, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She needed to get out of there before they saw her. Before she fell apart right in the middle of the hallway. Spinning on her heel, she walked away as fast as she could, her breath coming in uneven gasps. The office around her felt colder, emptier, like the walls themselves were mocking her. By the time she reached her desk, her decision was already made. She was done. She wasn't going to stay where she wasn't valued, where she was nothing more than a temporary convenience. Her fingers trembled as she typed her resignation letter, the words blurring together as she fought to keep her emotions in check. With a deep breath, she printed the document, folded it neatly, and walked straight to Ryan's office. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open with an iron resolve. Ryan looked up from his desk, his brows furrowing in surprise. "Laura?" She didn't trust herself to speak just yet. Instead, she placed the resignation letter on his desk with steady hands, her expression carefully blank. His gaze flickered to the paper, then back to her. "What is this?" Laura forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm resigning." A flicker of something, shock, confusion, crossed his face, but he masked it quickly. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing. "Why?" Laura almost laughed. "Why? Because I heard you. Because I was stupid enough to believe that you saw me as more than just an asset. Because I made the mistake of falling for you." Instead, she straightened her shoulders and said, "I think my time here has run its course." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." She let out a quiet breath. "It's the only one I'm giving." His eyes darkened, scanning her face, searching for something. But Laura didn't give him anything. She refused to break. After a long, tense silence, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." Laura smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, Ryan. The mistake was thinking I mattered." And with that, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving him speechless, leaving behind everything they had built, leaving him. The office felt colder than usual, the air heavier as Laura sat at her desk, staring at the blank document on her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she hesitated. Was this really how it ended? A part of her still wanted to believe there was an explanation, that she had misheard, misunderstood. But the words kept echoing in her head, over and over. She's useful, for now. We can reassess if she's worth keeping. A lump formed in her throat. She had been such a fool. Her hands clenched into fists as she swallowed the pain threatening to consume her. She had poured everything into this job, into proving herself. And for what? To be seen as a temporary convenience? A piece of strategy? Her heart clenched as she thought about Ryan, about all the moments that had felt real. The long nights working side by side, the teasing glances, the way his voice had softened when he said her name. Had it all been in her head? Maybe she had just been reading into things that were never there. Her chest tightened and she forced herself to take a deep breath. No. She wouldn't let herself fall apart. Not here. Not over him. With renewed determination, she placed her fingers on the keyboard and typed out her resignation letter. Each keystroke felt like a nail in the coffin of something she had once cared so deeply about. When she was done, she printed it, folded it neatly, and walked straight to Ryan's office. The door was slightly ajar, but he wasn't inside. Good. She stepped in, the familiar scent of his cologne lingering in the air, making her chest ache in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. She placed the letter on his desk, right where he couldn't ignore it, and turned to leave. But before she could step out, his voice stopped her cold. Laura? Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay composed. Slowly, she turned to see Ryan standing in the doorway, his gaze locked onto hers. His brows furrowed as his eyes flickered to the piece of paper sitting on his desk. His expression darkened. What is this? Laura didn't flinch. You know what it is. Ryan stepped forward, his jaw tightening as he picked up the letter, skimming through it. Then, he looked up, eyes blazing. You're resigning? She crossed her arms over her chest, masking the turmoil inside her. Yes. Ryan's nostrils flared, his grip on the paper tightening. Why? Laura let out a breath, her voice steady but cold. Because I don't work for people who only see me as useful. Ryan's gaze sharpened. What the hell is that supposed to mean? You know exactly what it means. She bit back, her voice laced with hurt and anger. His brows furrowed for a split second before something clicked in his eyes. You heard me, he murmured, almost to himself. Laura's chest ached, but she refused to let it show. Yeah, she said, her voice hollow. I heard everything. Ryan's jaw clenched, his fingers crumpling the edges of the letter. It wasn't like that, Laura. It sounded exactly like that, she interrupted, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. You made it pretty clear, Ryan. I'm an asset. Something to be kept close until I'm no longer valuable. His eyes darkened, frustration flickering across his face. That's not what I meant. Then tell me, she challenged, stepping closer. What did you mean? Silence. Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came. And in that moment, Laura knew. If he had really cared, if she had truly meant something to him beyond just her work, he would have said it. He wouldn't be standing there, struggling to find words. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Exactly what I thought. She turned to leave, but before she could step past him, his hand wrapped around her wrist. Laura? His voice was quieter now, almost desperate. Don't do this. Her heart wavered for a second, just a second, but then she pulled free. I already did, she whispered. And then, without another word, she walked away, leaving him behind, leaving everything behind. But as the elevator doors closed, and the weight of it all crashed down on her, she realized something. She had thought quitting would feel like freedom. So why did it feel like losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered? The moment Laura walked out of his office, something inside Ryan shifted. He had spent the entire night replaying the conversation in his mind, the words he had said, the way she had looked at him, the pain in her eyes when she told him she had heard everything. She thought he didn't care. She thought she was just an asset to him. And that realization wrecked him. For so long, he had convinced himself that keeping his emotions buried was the safest option. That keeping his distance, staying in control, was the only way to avoid falling too deep. But now Laura was gone, and the ache in his chest refused to go away. He had spent weeks denying what was right in front of him, the way she challenged him, the way she made him feel alive in a way no one else ever had. And he had lost her because of his own silence. No, he wasn't going to let this end like this. so he made a decision, one he would never have made before. At the next company event, Ryan stood on the stage, microphone in hand, surrounded by employees, investors, and executives. The crowd was buzzing with quiet conversations, completely unaware of the storm raging inside him. His eyes scanned the room, searching for her. And then, there she was, Laura, standing near the back, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he almost lost his nerve. But then he met her gaze, and nothing else mattered. Clearing his throat, he spoke. "I don't usually do this," he admitted, his voice steady but low. "And if you know me, you know that I don't say things unless I mean them." A hush fell over the crowd. Laura's brows furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. Ryan took a deep breath, then continued. "I made a mistake," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "A big one." A murmur ran through the audience, but Ryan didn't look away from her. "There's someone in this room who thinks they don't matter to me. Someone who believes I only saw them as an employee, an asset, when the truth is, I was too much of a coward to admit how much they meant to me." Laura stiffened, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Ryan's chest tightened, but he kept going. "When I said she was important to this company, I meant it. But what I failed to say was that she's important to me in ways that have nothing to do with work." Silence. Laura didn't move. Ryan took a slow step forward, his voice softening, but the weight of his words undeniable. "She's the only person who ever challenged me, who stood up to me, called me out on my arrogance and refused to back down. She's the only person I've ever met who could make me rethink everything I thought I knew." Laura's breath hitched. "She's not just an asset." His voice lowered, raw and honest. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the crowd, but Ryan didn't care. He had spent too long running from this. Not anymore. Slowly, Laura uncrossed her arms, her face a mix of shock and something else, something he couldn't quite read. Ryan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I should have told you sooner," he said, his voice hoarse. "But if you'll give me another chance, if you'll let me, I'd spend every day proving that you're not just someone I need in this company." His throat tightened. "You're someone I need. Period." Silence. Ryan waited, heart pounding, unsure if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Then Laura took a slow step forward. And Ryan? He held his breath, hoping like hell that this time she wouldn't walk away. For a long moment, Laura said nothing. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Ryan stood still, his heart pounding, waiting for her to walk away again. But she didn't. Instead, she took a slow, hesitant step forward. Her eyes, once filled with hurt, now held something softer. Something unsure but willing. "You meant all of that?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ryan nodded once, his expression unguarded in a way it had never been before. Every word, Laura exhaled, as if releasing all the weight she had been carrying. Maybe she had been too quick to judge, too hurt to see what had really been there all along. And now, she saw it, the raw honesty in his eyes, the way his voice had cracked, the way he had put everything on the line for her. A slow, unbelieving smile tugged at her lips. "For a guy who doesn't like talking, you just gave one hell of a speech." Ryan chuckled, relief washing over him. Desperate times. For a moment, it was just them standing in the middle of a crowded room. Yet somehow, it felt like the world had faded away. Then, with a deep breath, Laura stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his. "I think," she whispered, "I'd like to give this a chance." Ryan's lips curled into a slow, genuine smile, and just like that, their story, one that had started with a slap, turned into something neither of them had ever expected.